Hello and welcome to the President's class at the Philosophical Research Society, continuing now on YouTube under the pandemic. I hope you all are well. So this is our last lecture and discussion in this series, Voices of Wisdom from Native Cultures. And honestly, it's one of my, how shall I put this? Louise Erdrich is obviously one of my favorite writers in the world. And she's also one of my greatest teachers. Now, she doesn't know this. We've met a couple of times, but that's the beauty of it, is she has taught me so much through the worlds she has created in her novels and poetry. And I mean not only about life, but also about academic things. She's taught me so much about the sacred myth and ritual and community. And in fact, I did a chapter of my dissertation on one of her novels, and she's been teaching me ever since about all kinds of things. And I hope you'll get a sense of that tonight as we look through some of her work and hear her story and her voice. So we always do this. We always kind of think about what we're doing with these lectures and discussions. And what we're doing is we're understanding the notion of land and place in native cultures, and that we occupy that land. And so that's a very difficult and fraught situation that if we're not paying attention to, we haven't really understood these voices. Language is so important for all native people, and you're going to see tonight just how insightful and profound language can be for a native writer. I think it's true for all of them, but Erdrich in particular is attuned to this notion, as she is to history. And it is a terrible history of native white people, and yet at the same time it's an embedded history. And so you'll see that Erdrich is part German and part Ojibwe. So she plays with that rather than trying to turn away from that or try to deny one part of that. She integrates them. Well, I don't know if that's the right word. She puts them in dialogue, and there's an inherent and pervasive tension between those identities and those heritages that she never fully resolves. But in that tension, there is an immense creativity and profundity, and I would say even wisdom. Catholics, part of her religious heritage is Catholic, and Catholic literally means universal. And so Catholics and other Christians and other religions that are missionary in nature are about abstracting a religious experience of the founder and applying it regardless of space or place to all people, potentially all people, in other places and at other times. In fact, all these notions, whether it's Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, or Native Ojibwe culture and religion, they all are grounded in space and place. And what we saw with Vine Deloria, how if you're in a culture like Western culture that is oriented toward time, space must give way to time. Time consumes space to a point, and then space bites back. So what we want to do is not universalize the wisdom found in these texts, but just to listen. And if we're not listening, then we're appropriating, right? We're taking again from these cultures for whom everything else has been taken. So these people are speaking. Louise Erdrich and the other writers and native people are speaking. They're still here. They're still profound. They still have voices, and they're speaking. And so this lecture, like all the other lectures and discussions, is an act of listening to those voices. All right? So Louise Erdrich is Ojibwe. That's typically the Canadian term. Chippewa is the American term. Neither of those terms are quite right. They are Anishinaabe or Ojibwe. The original people. Erdrich is from the Turtle Mountain Band of the Chippewa. So you may see all three of these terms, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, or Chippewa. She's from the Turtle Mountain Band, and the Ojibwe people, migrated from the eastern seaboard. We saw last week how the Kiowa migrated from western Montana. The Ojibwe people migrated from the eastern seaboard and then up around the Great Lakes and then eventually over into the Canadian Plains, North Dakota and Saskatchewan. Oh, there it is, North Dakota and Saskatchewan. There are about 30,000 members of the Turtle Mountain Band of the Chippewa, and they are spread out. Some are on the res, some are in cities. And we saw why that is the case, because of Eisenhower's termination policy in the 50s, which moved many Native people to the cities in yet another attempt to take land from the people. All right, so Erdrich was born June 16th, 1954 in Little Falls, Minnesota. And she ends up living most of her life, her childhood, I should say, in Wahpeton. I believe I'm pronouncing that right. I looked it up. Wahpeton, North Dakota. Now, this is, I don't know if you've been to North Dakota, but it's a confluence of, Canadian, French, German, and Native peoples there. And you'll see all this at work in Erdrich's writings, especially the German part. So Wahpeton becomes Argus in her story world. She has an Ojibwe mother and a German father, both of whom taught on the at the BIA schools on reservations there. She was greatly influenced by her grandfather, Patrice Gourneau. She attended Catholic school in Wahpeton, and her grandfather, Gourneau, taught her so much. He was the tribal chair of the Turtle Mountain Reservation, and he was thoroughly an adept of the Ojibwe religion at the same time as being a devout Catholic. And this will explain a lot about Erdrich, as you'll see. In fact, if you know Erdrich's work, then you know a character named Father Damien. And Father Damien was inspired by Erdrich's grandfather, Patrice Gourneau. I love this. She writes, she says, that Native American literature for her is about coming home, returning to the land, to the language and love of ancient traditions, which she notes is a theme opposite of much of Western literature, which is about embarking on a journey, finding adventures beyond one's beginning. What a wonderful, insightful statement. And we've seen this throughout our discussions of these Native writers. Think of Zikala Shah and how her writing is about coming home. It's about finding home. And there's a quite practical reason for this, and that is that their homes were taken. Zikala Shah is taken or sent away to boarding school. Many Native children were sent away to boarding schools, as we've discussed. And so home becomes such an important concept, and literature becomes a way of writing themselves home. I like that so much, and so different from Western culture. So, for example, the Odyssey is an odyssey. The Greek word means the road out, or the road. And sure, Odysseus, the bulk of the Odyssey is about Odysseus's adventures away from home. And he does come home, but when he comes home, there's such an odd character to his homecoming. It's bloody and violent and apocalyptic. Whereas for Native people, it's about recovering a home that was stolen from them. And so there's violence involved, but it's not endemic to the homecoming. Whereas for Odysseus, it is part of the homecoming. I mean, it's some of the goriest literature in the Western canon. Is the ending of the Odyssey. All right, so more about Erdrich. In 1972, she enrolled in Dartmouth College, and that was part of the school's first coeducational graduating class. Now, I don't know if you know anything about Dartmouth. It's a beautiful campus in Hanover, New Hampshire, but it was founded as a school for Indians, as they put it. And so she enrolled in 1972 in their first coeducational graduating class. And there she met an interesting man named Michael Doris, who was also new and had created their Native American Studies program there at Dartmouth, now a well-known Native Studies program. She graduated in 1976 with her BA and worked closely with Doris. He helped her find and write poems and stories about her Ojibwe heritage. And in fact, in 1975, she was awarded the American Academy of Poets Prize, and then received her bachelor's degree. So wins a poetry prize before she even graduates, and you'll see that was well done. There's a good reason she won a poetry prize. She's one of the greatest living poets. 1979, she gets an MFA, a Master of Fine Arts, from Johns Hopkins University. She reconnects with Michael Doris, and they go their separate ways again. This is after she comes back to do a poetry reading. I don't know if I said that or not, to Dartmouth. He goes off to New Zealand. She becomes a visiting fellow in the Native American Studies department. They keep in touch by letter. They meet back at Dartmouth the next year and are married in 1981. Now, this relationship has received a lot of attention, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I don't know that it's that important, but it is a part of her story, and so I want to mention it. There was the representation at the beginning that they were complete collaborators. Every book under the name Louise Erdrich was also written by Michael Doris. Michael Doris, you may know if you've read anything about fetal alcohol syndrome, because he adopted a child, a Native child, with fetal alcohol syndrome, and wrote a book called The Broken Cord about this experience. And it's harrowing. It's a harrowing memoir of trying to raise this child with this devastating learning disability. Let me keep going. So that was how they presented themselves as collaborators. Michael Doris also wrote an amazing novel called A Yellow Raft in Blue Water. Absolutely beautiful. Doesn't get the attention I think it deserves because of his other book, The Broken Cord, which gets much more attention, and it should. But he was an incredible novelist. They were married, and then they were separating, and the following year after their separation, he committed suicide. For Erdrich, writing was her salvation. And as you'll see in a few slides from now, she saved herself through this. She processed that grief through writing, and she basically bled on the page through her characters. And she has become, in the process, Well, I don't think she's actually technically the most prolific Native American writer. I think that's probably Gerald Visner, who's also an Anishinaabe. Um, but she's close. What a body of work. In fact, she owns a little bookstore in Minneapolis. And I've been there. It's just a nice little bookstore. It's called Birch Bark Books, and it has a canoe hanging from the ceiling. It has a Catholic confessional that she salvaged from an old church. Again, she's Catholic and Ojibwe. She established the Birch Bark House Fund to support Indigenous language teaching and revitalization. And she works with her sister Hyde to promote and publish material in Ojibwe and translations from Ojibwe to English, again, language, right? So important. All right, so here are her works. They are many and they are profound. So they're divided up here into genre. So here's fiction. So you see she has a book out this year called The Night Watchman. And her first novel was Love Medicine in 1984. And then all these amazing works, many of which are part of her Argus series, this world that I'm going to talk about in a minute, that she creates, which is a fictional version of Wapaton, North Dakota, and there are Germans and Ojibways and everybody and everything there. We'll see a little bit of that as we go ahead here. So here are more of her works. Poetry. Notice that Jacklight comes out in 1984, the same year as Love Medicine. Baptism of Desire, my favorite book of poetry of hers, absolutely incredible. And in fact, we're going to do a fairly close reading of one of the poems in Baptism of Desire tonight. Notice that she's also a children's writer. The Birch Bark House is really good and well received among children's literature folks. And nonfiction. Blue Jay's Dance is worth a read. A Birth Year is her diary of while she was pregnant and having the baby. By the way, Baptism of Desire was also that. It's a book of poetry born of her pregnancy when she couldn't sleep, would get up at 3 a.m. for a snack and ended up writing poetry. It is so profound. Let me go back here. Right, so I love this and this line from her. It didn't occur to me that my books would be widely read at all. And that enabled me to write anything I wanted to. And even once I realized they were being read, I still wrote as if I were writing in secret. That's how one has to write anyway, in secret. This reminds me of the first time I met her. She was doing a reading at the University of Georgia with Michael Doris. And I think she read from tracts and some of her poetry. And during the Q&A, I told her, I said, I'm a teacher and I'm teaching tracts and your novel tracts. And I wonder if you might, have anything to say about how you think it should be taught. And she was genuinely surprised. This was not affectation. She was genuinely surprised that someone was teaching a novel in her novel in a university and tracts at that. And she was just really taken aback and honestly didn't have an answer for me. So I went up to get tracts signed by her and Yellow Raft in Blue Water, signed by Michael Doris, and they were very kind and generous, and he had some nice comments, and then she again remarked about how stunned she was that I was teaching one of her novels in a university classroom. And I'll never forget this. She wrote in my copy of tracts, "Start with snakes." Start with snakes, Louise Erdrich. Okay. And if you read tracts, you'll see what all that means. Start with snakes. So, okay. So she says this in relation to what I've called the Argus series, or whatever you want to call it. There's a whole story world that a number of these novels contribute to. And she's been compared to Faulkner, Yoknapatawpha County in Mississippi. I kind of don't like comparisons like that because it tends to diminish both writers, but I see why people say that. It's because she's writing a landscape, a place. And this is not usual for authors to continue to come back to a place and to keep telling the stories of that place. It happens with Faulkner and a few others. But for Erdrich, this is a world that is populated with fascinating characters, events, stories, and surprises. So she notes this, since writing Love Medicine, I've understood that I'm writing one long book, and that indeed that's how it feels, in which the main chapters are also books titled Tracts, Four Souls, The Bingo Palace, The Last Report on the Miracles at Little No Horse, and The Painted Drum. So indeed, there is Argus, Little No Horse, Hoop Dance, Fargo, and the Twin Cities. These are the cities in this world, or the villages. They take place, the events take place from the 1930s, basically, to the present of the writing. And then the families there are amazing. We have the Cashpaws, the Lamartines, the Morrisseys, the Pillagers, and the Lazars. And they are all, full rounded characters, let's say. I was going to say they're all a mess, and some of them are a mess, but I wouldn't say they're all a mess. You'll see. What's in this one long book? Oh my goodness, so much. Storytelling. Orality and literacy. I've talked a lot in this series about orality and literacy and at PRS and the importance of recognizing that the medium is the message. And in fact, writing transforms consciousness. There's no better demonstration than that. Well, I hate saying no better. There is a fascinating and powerful demonstration of that in Erdrich's work. She knows this, she feels this, and she has her characters embody this dynamic between orality and literacy. And you'll hear one of her best characters talk about this in just a little while. This story world is about kinship, who's related to whom and how and why and what that means, whether it means everything or it means nothing or it means something in between. The sacred. I did a chapter of my dissertation on tracts. And that's when Louise Erdrich began to teach me not just about life, but about the academic study of the sacred, because my dissertation was on representing the sacred. And she showed me, and other Native writers showed me, a whole different theory of the sacred, different from what I knew, being a Westerner, growing up in America, growing up in a Protestant household and culture where the sacred was other. Well, let's not get into that. It's a little complex, but basically the theory of the sacred from Eliade to Otto to William James is this otherness that's out there and that you encounter, and where Erdrich is brilliant is showing that these things are ordinarily sacred. Okay, so sacred in the everyday, and that is what you see in Native cultures in general, is the sacred is not something outside that breaks in. It's always there. And where it is in relation. in relation, all my relations. And Erdrich is brilliant with that. At the same time, she recognizes borders and boundaries, especially in tracks. I mean, tracks, the very title, right? It creates border. She's interested in not only the borders of land and reservations and cities, but also the borders of identity. There it is, fragmentation and identity. A primary feature of her work is a characterization, a kind of characterization that I don't see anywhere else, by which I mean simply that her characterizations are so deep and yet unresolved. And there's a built-in tension with nearly every character in her work. Nobody's got it figured out. Everybody's conflicted about love and life and what it means to be a Native person or an Ojibwe or a Catholic or a butcher or whatever. Just amazing stuff. Let me give you just a little taste of what's in this book. So remember, she's a poet, and like many of these writers we've studied, so I love poets who are novelists because they become long poems with narratives in between. And so you get these moments like this. The greatest wisdom doesn't know itself. The richest plan is not to have one. The greatest wisdom doesn't know itself, right? What a wonderful relief to know that I don't have to know. That the greatest wisdom doesn't know itself. The richest plan is not to have one. Indeed, I hear Walt Whitman's voice in that, and many other writers, but there it is in 2 sentences, and a deep wisdom. I love this one too. Grandpa's mind had left us, gone wild and wary, and when I walked with him, I could feel how strange it was. His thoughts swam between us, disappearing in weeds, and I was fishing for them, dangling my own words like baits and lures. Now, she's talking about someone who has dementia, but I think she's talking about everyone, really, because communication is the only tissue we have between us, and so it can seem like his thoughts were swimming between us, hidden under rocks, and I'm trying to get your thoughts, right? Everything is about language. All right, let's get to tracks now. So this is her 3rd novel, and Love Medicine was contemporary, so it was 1984, so it was set in contemporary time, and so was The Beat Queen. And then here comes Tracks, which is a prequel to the story world. So 1912, 1924, right in there. And let me just introduce you to a few of the characters and describe them, because I cannot give you an adequate picture of the story. There are too many plot lines and twists and characters. For example, there's a double narrator here, so you're getting 2 stories all along. And anyway, let me just talk about this. So there is Nanapush, who is a trickster figure. Now, the Ojibwe trickster figure is called Nanabozo or Winnabozo, and it depends on who's speaking as to how you pronounce it. We don't have to get into that, but Nanabozo. So Nanapush is clearly a trickster figure, and the Ojibwe trickster is different. We know tricksters as being having a kind of sharp edge to them. They can be mean, they can be greedy, they can be destructive. The Ojibwe trickster is not so, doesn't have that sharp edge to him, Nanabozo. He is a teacher, like all tricksters, but he really has a good heart. And while he gets into trouble and makes mistakes, he doesn't do it by hurting people so much as by simply not being wise and learning to become wise. So This is Nanapush. Now, he's a character in this novel, but he's clearly that Ojibwe trickster figure. And he's one of the narrators. So he writes this, or says this. This is early on in the novel. I guided the last buffalo hunt. I saw the last bear shot. I trapped the last beaver with a pelt of more than 2 years' growth. I spoke aloud the words of the government treaty and refused to sign the settlement papers that would take away our woods and lake. I axed the last birch that was older than I, and I saved the last pillager. He also notes Nanapush in particular is very keenly aware of this oral literate dynamic. He's very suspicious of writing and the tracks that are made on paper. And he says this in the novel, Nanapush is a name that loses power every time it is written and stored in a government file. That's why I only give it out once in all those years. Right. So one of the opening scenes in the novel is Nanapush and Fleur Pillager starving in the cold. And I swear, I've never read something that, never written anything like this either, never read something that was so visceral that I got cold reading about the cold and hunger. I got cold and hungry reading about how they're sitting in this shed, freezing, potentially dying without food, and they can feel the ancestors, the people who died, coming to greet them. And their presence is there in the cabin in the bitter cold and the bitter pangs of hunger. And they have to summon great effort not to speak their names aloud, because that will bring them back permanently, and they don't want to do that. So just so many scenes, like every scene is like that. So if you think Nanapush is interesting, meet Pauline Pouliot, who is native Ojibwe, but she has consciously and conspicuously rejected her Ojibwe roots because she wants to be a Westerner. She wants to be wholly white, as she puts it. And note the homonym there, holy as in completely, but also as in sacred white, Holy. Therefore, she learns writing, and she has some wonderful descriptions of learning her writing. She's also belongs to the dead by design. So she says this in her narrative. She's the other narrator in Tracks. She says, I handled the dead until the cold feel of their skin was a comfort, until I no longer bothered to bathe once I left the cabin, but touched others with the same hands, passed death on. I know that's a significant and resonant metaphor during the pandemic, but that's how she thought of it. And in fact, that's the Catholic theology of death, is that it gets passed on like a virus from Adam all the way down. It gets passed on in the blood. Pauline joins a convent, and this is her work to handle the dead, and that's because she likes it. Now, there is the most powerful creature, the most powerful character here is Fleur Pillager. She is thoroughly Ojibwe, does not adopt anything new, anti-assimilationist. She will interact with the whites in Argus, but she has nothing to do with them until the end, which you can see when you read the novel. She gambles with her male co-workers in the butcher shop. She beats them because if you read Gerald Visioner, the Anishinaabe critic, especially a book called Narrative Chance, he describes how games of chance are really significant for Native people, and they understand them well. Again, don't take my summary of it, read him. She lose the men she plays with and Argus plays cards with lose big to her, and so they react as men do when they lose something. She probably causes a tornado in August, and some of the most interesting passages refer to her being the bride of the water creature Mishipishu, a great dragon, snake-like creature in the lake there. She's a shapeshifter. She goes and hunts for food as an animal. Really, really interesting. 3 characters right there. Two of whom have voices, and Fleur almost doesn't need a voice. It's almost like her character itself speaks volume. She terrifies men in particular. You can imagine how she and Pauline get along. Pauline, by the way, if you've read Love Medicine, Pauline is Sister Leopolda in that novel. But this goes back to before Pauline was a nun. All right, so here's Nanapush talking again about orality and literacy. But once the bureaucrats sink their barbed pens into the lives of Indians, the paper starts flying. A blizzard of legal forms, a waste of ink by the gallon, a correspondence to which there is no end or reason. That's when I began to see what we were becoming, and the years have borne me out. A tribe of file cabinets and triplicates, a tribe of single-spaced documents, directives, policy, a tribe of pressed trees, a tribe of chicken scratch that can be scattered by a wind, diminished to ashes by one struck match. Nice, right? Okay, so please read the Argus novels or anything by Louise Erdrich. And what I want to do here at the end is take you through this poem, this amazing poem that first appeared in Baptism of Desire, right? All right, so just stay with me here, and I'm going to go slowly so you can process it, but just kind of think about what you're thinking as you hear each line, okay? He was formed of chicken blood and lightning. He was what fell out when the jug tipped. He was waiting at the bottom of the cliff when the swine plunged over. He tore out their lungs with a sound like ripping silk. He hacked the pink carcasses apart so that the ribs spread like a terrible butterfly, and there was darkness. It was he who turned the handle and let the dogs rush from the basements. He shoved the crust of a volcano into his roaring mouth. He showed one empty hand. The other gripped a crowbar, a monkey wrench, a crop, which was the tail of the ass that bore them to Egypt, one in each saddlebag, sucking twists of honeyed goat skin, arguing already over a woman's breasts. He understood the prayers that rose in every language, for he had split the human tongue. He was not the devil, nor among the fallen. It was just that he was clumsy and curious and liked to play with knives. He was the dove hypnotized by boredom and betrayed by light. He was the pearl in the mouth, the tangible emptiness that saints seek at the center of their prayers. He leaped into a shadow when the massive stone rolled across the entrance, sealing him with his brother in the dark as in the beginning. Only this time, he emerged first. bearing the self-inflicted wound. Both brass halos tacked to the back of his skull, he raised 2 crooked fingers. The extra dye tumbled from his lips when he preached, but no one noticed. They were too busy clawing at the hem of his robe and planning how to sell him to the world. They were too busy drinking at the fountain. They were drunk. They would drown for love. Okay, what's happening here? Well, we know twin mythology. It appears in native cultures quite a bit. In fact, it appears in a lot of mythologies, even the Jewish mythology with Cain and Abel, and Jacob and Esau, etc. But it's fairly common in world mythologies for there to be culture heroes, brothers, who bring the people culture. They teach them how to do things, how to make things. They bring technology. They bring wisdom and knowledge. And invariably, in these world mythologies, you will have one twin who is creative. I don't want to say good and evil, because again, Erdrich doesn't want us to do that. One twin who is creative and one who is destructive. And so you might have a twin who creates mountains, and then his younger brother comes along and creates earthquakes. You might have a twin create a river that flows in both directions. Wouldn't that be nice and interesting? And then his younger brother comes along, as younger brothers do, and undoes his brother's work. And so now rivers flow in only one direction. So Erdrich is taking the Christ story and making a twins story out of it. What does this do? Well, it creates multiplicity, right? It creates more than one. And so it creates a dialogic relationship between the two, right? And so I don't know if you've noticed this, but when you go from polytheism to monotheism, what happens is that the characteristics, many of the characteristics of these various gods in polytheism become various attributes of the single God in monotheism. And Erdrich is undoing that move here in the poem. And so what happens when you create this multiplicity is there is invariably dialogue. There's invariably two things that must interact in some way. I mean dialogue in the philosophical sense of two-ness. And so what that does, what the poem does, is show us the seduction of the one. Because what happens in the poem? We chose the wrong Christ. Christianity chose the wrong Christ in this poem. The trickster, the one who was clumsy and curious and liked to play with knives. The one who tacked 2 brass halos to the back of his skull. The one that had the extra dye tumbling from his mouth when he preaches. And so where's his elder brother? Still in the tomb, right? He emerged first, the poem reads. And we were seduced by him. We were drinking at the fountain, and we were drunk, and we would drown for love because of this twin. Now, notice what this does. It's so amazing. So we've talked all along about how Christian and Western mythology was forced onto native people. What's that like? Well, we don't know because we're inside that mythology and that religion, Christianity. Even if we're not a Christian, we're still inside it. And so it's hard for us to imagine what that feels like, right? To have your mythology. Remember the story of the Seneca with the missionary in The Soul of the Indian. We believed your story. Why won't you believe ours? Here, Erdrich is reversing that colonial move. And so she says, you want to know what it feels like to have your mythology transformed into something else? while our mythology was transformed into the one story, and remember the missionary in the Eastman story says, what you've told me is mere fable and falsehood, and what I've given you is the truth. Erdrich says, see how this feels. And it's not petty like that. It's instructive. In fact, it's profound. Here's your one Christ myth, your one God story. And what if it's the wrong God? Because, there are twins. They're the sons of God, the sons of the Creator. They're usually two. Where's your other one? Did you leave him in the tomb? And you're worshiping the wrong one? The younger, mischievous brother who's clumsy and curious and likes to play with knives. What then is the wisdom of Louise Erdrich? Well, a lot there just in Christ's twin, and I don't even want to speculate too much about what the wisdom of Louise Erdrich is, because it's there in her work, in her prolific and profound work, and it's there for you to get on your own. She is one of the most articulate voices coming from Native cultures, and I would say one of the most accessible. So there are Native writers like Gerald Visner, who is intentionally cryptic and confusing. He wants that to be part of your reading experience. Erdrich can be cryptic and confusing, but that is not the overall experience of her work. In fact, what you get is what's true of humanity, is the struggle with identity, the constitutive power of language and story, the importance of land and how it shapes or fractures identity. There's just so much there. So what I want to do in closing here is just give you some of her words, some of the meanings, some of the passages that have profound meaning that for everyone, for us and for her characters and for anyone who lives. I love this passage from The Plague of Doves. When we are young, the words are scattered all around us. As they are assembled by experience, so also are we, sentence by sentence, until the story takes shape. That is, oh my God, yes, right? I'm always going on about the constitutive nature of language and story. Well, there it is. Words are scattered all around us. And I look back on my own life and I think, yes, I've just been picking up these words, as T.S. Eliot calls them, the fragments of these ruins, and assembling them. And that's what we do. We don't have raw material in the world. We have used material. These are words, and we assemble them in our experience. And in assembling these words and these sentences, we are constructing ourselves, because we're constructing a story, and the stories take shape, and the story is us. And the story is always changing. So it's not just that process and it's over. It's that process, and then we drop some things, or something comes in like a tornado in Argus, North Dakota, and it levels everything. And then you start over. You start over. In fact, I think our world is in that place right now where things are being leveled, and we're going to have to take what's left and reassemble it and make a new world. Related to this, from the last report on the miracles at Little No Horse, whenever he thought he knew the truth, it merged into another truth. Oh my goodness, right? I mentioned during the technology series, especially the lecture on truth, that truth has been the bane of my existence, the pursuit of my life from the time I was probably 19. And the whole idea was that if I could just find this truth through philosophy, through religious studies, through literature, if I could find this truth, then I'd be done. I'd have it figured out, right? But whenever you think you know a truth, it telescopes into another truth. Sometimes it's the opposite truth. But more often than not, it's simply a higher, it's not simply, but is profoundly a higher level of truth that doesn't make obsolete the previous truth, but in fact builds on it and then opens up into new ideas and new areas of being. How wonderful to be alive and to be able to do that, right? To go from truth to truth, to use your truth like a ladder to get to another point and then to live there for a while and then find another ladder and to keep climbing. And then this is where we get the title of our lecture tonight. And this is from The Painted Drum. You will actually see this around a lot because it's absolutely wonderful. And so let me just read it to you. Life will break you. Nobody can protect you from that. And living alone won't either. For solitude will also break you with its yearning. You have to love. You have to feel. It is the reason you are here on earth. You are here to risk your heart. You are here to be swallowed up. And when it happens that you are broken or betrayed or left or hurt or death brushes near, let yourself sit by an apple tree and listen to the apples falling all around you in heaps, wasting their sweetness. Tell yourself you tasted as many as you could. I cannot improve on that, on those words. Thank you for listening, and I hope you go into the worlds of Louise Erdrich because they are beautiful and broken and so human, human at its worst and human at our best. Thank you for listening.